The story of the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy Scriptures is a grand testimony to God's sovereignty over all nations. Representing the place where the Lord manifested His presence among His people, the Ark was more than a simple object. It symbolized the divine covenant, God's power, and justice. However, one of the most enigmatic and intriguing narratives of the Old Testament leads us to reflect on a disturbing episode: the capture of the Ark by the Philistines, a pagan people and declared enemies of Israel. How could the Philistines, who did not know or respect God, even touch the Ark of the Covenant and survive? This event leads us to a deep reflection on what it truly means to respect God's holiness and how He acts in the face of disobedience and irreverence, whether from His chosen people or from foreign nations. The historical context: Israel in disobedience. To understand this episode, we need to revisit the scenario in which it occurs. In 1 Samuel, chapters 4 to 6, we read that the people of Israel were at war with the Philistines, a traditional and feared enemy. Israel, spiritually weakened and distant from God's will, was suffering under the leadership of corrupt priests, such as Hophni and Phinehas, sons of Eli. These men, contrary to the expectations of priests, treated sacred things with contempt, leading the people into moral ruin. Amid a series of military defeats, the Israelites made a fatal mistake. They brought the Ark of the Covenant to the battlefield, believing that its physical presence would guarantee them victory. They had turned the symbol of God's presence into a lucky charm, a magical object that, in their distorted view, would coerce God Himself to act on their behalf. They ignored the fundamental principle: God's presence cannot be manipulated. The capture of the Ark by the Philistines. The result was devastating. Instead of triumphing, the Israelites were overwhelmingly defeated. Even worse, the Ark of the Covenant itself was captured by the Philistines. For Israel, this moment was one of despair. How could the Ark, which represented God's presence, fall into the hands of a pagan people? Could it be that the Lord had completely abandoned His people? The Philistines, in turn, saw the capture of the Ark as a great victory, not only over Israel but also over Israel's God. In their polytheistic view, this capture meant that their god, Dagon, had subdued the Lord of hosts. In an act of pride and irreverence, they placed the Ark in Dagon's temple, as if it were a trophy of war. The sacred in impure hands, the consequences of disrespect. But God will not be mocked. The next morning, the Philistines found Dagon's statue fallen face down before the Ark of the Covenant. It was as if the idol itself was bowing before the living God. They set the statue back up, but the following day, they found Dagon once again prostrate, this time with its head and hands cut off, a clear sign of total defeat. The capture of the Ark had been an act of presumption. Though the Philistines could physically touch the sacred object, they could not escape divine justice. Shortly after its capture, a series of plagues and afflictions struck them. The Bible records that tumors spread among the people, and a wave of destruction devastated their cities. Terror gripped the Philistine towns, and what they had considered a glorious victory became an unbearable curse. At this point, it becomes clear that it is not the physical touch that defines the holiness of the Ark, but rather the respect and reverence before God's power. The Philistines, though alive for a brief moment, suffered a devastating judgment for profaning what was sacred. God's Ark cannot be controlled. God's presence cannot be manipulated by anyone, not by the Philistines nor the Israelites themselves. Israel's mistake was to treat the Ark as a magical object, a tool to be used for their own benefit. The Philistines' error was to believe that by taking the Ark, they would also take control of God's power. However, God demonstrated His sovereignty to both peoples. The Philistines' decision to move the Ark from one city to another in a desperate attempt to escape divine wrath reveals their complete misunderstanding of the power they faced. Wherever they took the Ark, destruction followed. After 7 months of affliction, they finally acknowledged their powerlessness before the God of Israel and, in desperation, decided to return the ark. The return of the ark and the acknowledgement of God's sovereignty. The manner in which the ark was returned is a lesson in humility and fear. The Philistines placed the ark on a cart pulled by cows, without any human intervention, allowing the animals themselves to guide it. They understood that only God could decide the destiny of His ark. The fact that the ark returned to Israel without human intervention is a powerful testimony that God was always in control. Even when it seemed that His presence had been captured, He cannot be contained, manipulated, or defeated. His holiness demands reverence, and those who attempt to use or profane Him face inevitable consequences. This story leaves us with a profound and unquestionable message. God's holiness cannot be disrespected with impunity. Both the Israelites, for their irreverence and lack of obedience, and the Philistines, for their arrogance and disdain, faced God's judgment. The Ark of the Covenant, though a physical object, symbolized a much greater truth. The presence of God in our lives cannot be treated superficially. Today, we can reflect on how well we understand and respect God's holiness in our own lives. We are not called to carry sacred symbols or objects, but to carry God's presence in our hearts. However, if we do not treat that presence with the due respect and reverence, we may, like the ancient Israelites and Philistines, encounter judgment in our lives for our irreverence. The story of the ark captured and returned by the Philistines teaches us that God will always be sovereign. He does not need us to defend Him, but He demands that we revere Him with fear and trembling. His presence among us is a blessing, but also a call to responsibility and holiness. Did you like this video? Subscribe to the channel, like, and share with your friends so that more people can learn these powerful lessons from God's Word.